It started with flashing blue lights and a screaming voice echoing across the community gates. The kind of chaos that makes everyone peek through their curtains but pretend they didn't see anything. What most neighbors didn't know was that the man being yelled at wasn't a criminal or a trespasser. He was the community's own night watchman. A man named Rafiq, who had worked loyally for 4 years with a broom in one hand and a thermos of cheap black tea in the other. But none of that mattered to Karen Haskins, the woman who ruled the Willow Bend Lakes HOA like a queen from a decaying throne. Karen called the cops on Rafiq one humid evening, claiming he was acting suspicious near the community center even though it was his job to be there, and locking up the facilities for the night. Her voice over the 911 call, which we later heard in public records, was full of exaggerated panic, accusing Rafiq of lurking around and mumbling threats. She didn't mention that he was in uniform, or that she'd passed him dozens of times before, or that he had just greeted her politely not 5 minutes before she called the police. No, in Karen's world, someone like Rafiq didn't belong not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like and how little he owned. And when the police showed up, surrounding him with flashlights and barking questions, Rafiq stood silently, his calloused hands raised. His voice caught in his throat because he'd seen too many people like himself be treated like criminals for simply doing their jobs. But this wasn't just another HOA power trip. What Karen didn't know, what none of the HOA board members knew, was that Rafiq's younger brother Jamal was a decorated soldier stationed overseas. And when he found out what had happened, he wasn't going to let it go. Before we go further, don't forget to follow Sham stories if you love true tales of injustice, power abuse, and incredible comebacks. Because this isn't just the story of a watchman humiliated, this is the story of how he and his brother turned an entire HOA upside down. Now let's rewind the clock a bit. Rafiq had always been quiet. He wasn't the kind of man to insert himself into drama. He lived modestly in a shared apartment on the edge of town and sent most of his earnings back to his elderly parents and his brother Jamal, who was in military school when Rafiq first got hired. Worked the night shift at Willow Bend Lakes, a wealthy suburban neighborhood where residents paid too much in HOA dues and expected every hedge to be perfectly trimmed. His duties were simple: patrol the walking trails, lock the clubhouse and pool gate at night, and report anything unusual. He was punctual, polite, and invisible, which was exactly how the board liked it, until the night he wasn't. That particular evening, Karen had shown up at the clubhouse unannounced, claiming she needed to check on the water filters after a resident complaint. She didn't say who complained, and no work order was ever logged, but when Rafiq gently reminded her that all maintenance visits had to be pre-approved and logged in the HOA portal, she snapped. "Are you telling me I don't have the right to inspect property I manage?" She spat, stepping closer as if to intimidate him. Rafiq stood his ground, replying calmly, "Ma'am, I'm just following HOA procedures. I can't unlock the facility without approval." That was it. That was the moment he became her enemy. Her face twisted with offense as if she'd just been slapped by someone far beneath her. She stormed off without another word, but less than 15 minutes later, she was on the phone with 911, exaggerating everything. "He's standing near the building. I don't know what he's doing. He looked at me strangely. I feel unsafe." When the officers arrived, they detained Rafiq, questioned him, even searched him before finally verifying with the security company that he was indeed assigned to be there. But the damage was done. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that there was an incident involving the night guard. Karen told people that she had to intervene for safety, subtly implying there was more to the story than she could say. Rafiq returned to work the next night, but something had changed. Residents began avoiding him. Some stopped waving. One woman even clutched her purse tighter as she passed. He tried to stay focused, but he felt the invisible weight of suspicion. All because one woman, with a position and a voice, had decided he didn't look like he belonged. Meanwhile, Jamal was nearing the end of his tour in the Middle East. When he heard from their parents what had happened to Rafiq, he exploded with anger. She did what? And nobody stood up for him? Jamal was the kind of man who believed in respect not because of his uniform, but because of how hard his brother had worked to make sure he had opportunities. Jamal had watched Rafiq's struggle, skip meals to send money home, and endure the heat of Texas nights while others sat in air-conditioned comfort. So when he came home on leave, Jamal didn't go straight to a bar or a party. Put on civilian clothes, grabbed a notebook, and started documenting everything. He visited the HOA office pretending to be a potential security consultant, and they, not knowing who he was, handed him a stack of policy documents. He walked the neighborhood during the day, quietly asking residents how they felt about the board, and especially about Karen. What he discovered was shocking, not just about what Karen had done to Rafik, but what she'd done to others. 1 woman said Karen fined her for parking her own car too close to her mailbox. Another said Karen once entered her backyard to check the grass height without permission. A teenager said Karen tried to report him for loitering when he was just waiting for his ride. Jamal knew then this wasn't just about his brother. It was about power and how people like Karen weaponized their position to humiliate anyone they viewed as beneath them. So Jamal got to work. He gathered affidavits. He met with Rafik's security company and found out they had multiple complaints from Karen on record, including one where she accused a guard of smelling unprofessional. Jamal then filed a formal complaint with the HOA's Oversight Council, independent legal body responsible for reviewing homeowner disputes in the county. He submitted his evidence with precision, using military-level discipline to organize every document, every timestamp, every violation. Karen had no idea what was coming. Before the complaint could be reviewed, Karen made her next move, and this time, she went too far. She called the security company and demanded that Rafik be replaced, claiming he had made her feel threatened and refused direct instructions from management. The company, fearing backlash from such a powerful client, suspended Rafik pending review. Rafik didn't protest, simply turned in his badge and walked home, heartbroken but shoulders still straight. But Jamal wasn't going to let that stand. He knew this wasn't just HOA drama anymore, this was war. You'll see how a soldier turned civilian launched a full-scale operation to bring Karen's tyranny to light and how the community finally began to see who their real threat was. Keep reading because justice is just getting started. The moment Rafik turned in his badge, a ripple of shame and silence spread across the community like a fog. Most neighbors knew something wasn't right, but only a few had the courage to admit it aloud. Karen walked around with smug pride in her posture, pretending the situation was settled, acting as though she had cleaned up a security concern rather than gotten an innocent man suspended based on her prejudice and lies. But what she failed to realize was that by pushing Rafik out, she had awakened something much larger and more dangerous than a quiet night watchman. She had drawn the attention of Jamal's younger brother, a man trained for war, disciplined by service, and empowered by a personal mission to bring the truth to light. While Karen basked in the illusion of victory, Jamal was gathering intelligence. Over the next week, he met quietly with several residents who were still willing to talk. Many were too afraid to speak publicly, but privately admitted that they had long suspected Karen of abuse of power. Few shared that they'd been fined for invisible violations, or had surprise inspections where Karen appeared without warning. One elderly couple, the Mortons, even revealed that Karen had once threatened to have their granddaughter banned from visiting because her car had an expired registration sticker. Jamal recorded every statement, took down names, and asked 4 copies of every notice Karen had issued in the past year. But he didn't stop there. He also filed a formal complaint with the HOA Oversight Board. Not just against Karen, but against the board members who enabled her, using language that was precise and unyielding. Jamal accused them of failing to hold her accountable, violating HOA procedural codes, creating an environment where discrimination could thrive unchecked. His submission included not just testimonials and security company statements, but also 911 call logs, time-stamped footage, and policy violations. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Jamal requested a special hearing with the Oversight Council, a rare public forum where residents could present grievances in person and the HOA would be forced to respond. Once that hearing date was set, the community began buzzing with rumors. Karen tried to downplay it, telling neighbors it was just some nonsense from an angry family, but deep down she knew she was losing control. Jamal, meanwhile, prepared. A presentation worthy of a court-martial. On the night of the hearing, the community center was more packed than it had ever been. Folding chairs filled every corner, and some people had to stand along the walls. Even board members who normally skipped meetings were there, wide-eyed and nervous. Karen sat at the front, arms crossed, face unreadable. When Jamal took the floor, he stood not in anger, but in quiet command. He began with a photo of his brother, Fik in uniform, holding a flashlight beside the clubhouse on a peaceful night. "This is the man you humiliated," Jamal said. "A man who guarded your homes while you slept. A man who never once raised his voice, broke a rule, or asked for anything in return. And this is what your leadership did to him." He then proceeded to outline the timeline, the baseless 911 call, the exaggerated accusations, the silence that followed, and the subsequent targeting of Rafik by Karen. He presented video footage, showing Karen passing Rafik with no signs of distress, only to call 911 minutes later. He read from the transcript of the call, emphasizing how she described him as a threat despite knowing full well who he was. Then he displayed the letter Karen sent to the security company, in which she cited insubordination and menacing behavior. Words he highlighted against actual eyewitness reports contradicting her claims. But Jamal wasn't finished. He then unveiled a series of infractions committed by Karen as HOA president, unauthorized citations, misuse of HOA funds, retaliatory fines against residents who complained about her behavior, and even evidence that she had used her position to push through fines against families she personally disliked. Each piece of evidence brought louder whispers from the crowd, some gasps, some shaking heads. But it was the final testimony that changed everything. Jamal played an audio recording of an elderly resident, Mr. Green, who hadn't been able to attend due to illness. In it, Mr. Green's voice trembled as he recounted how Karen had banged on his door one evening demanding that he remove unsightly lawn chairs from his porch. When he tried to explain they were necessary for his arthritis, she threatened to fine him and accused him of creating a health hazard. You could feel the shame settle over the room like a fog. Karen's expression shifted, no longer smug but cornered. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood slowly and launched into a mechanical defense, calling the accusations exaggerated and rooted in personal vendetta. She tried to discredit Jamal, calling him emotionally reactive and misinformed. She insisted that her actions were in alignment with community safety protocols, but no one believed her. The Oversight Council, seated at a long table near the stage, remained silent as she spoke, occasionally jotting down notes, but mostly listening with arms folded and brows furrowed. When she finished, one council member finally asked, "Ms. Haskins, do you deny making the 911 call?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but I felt unsafe." The council member pressed further. "Even though Mr. Rafik was on duty, in uniform, and had spoken to you politely just minutes earlier," Karen stammered but offered no real explanation. Another council member added, "And the fine you issued to Mr. Green was that safety related as well?" Silence. And that's when the tide officially turned. The council ruled that Karen had violated multiple clauses of the HOA charter, acted in bad faith, abused her authority, and created a hostile environment through targeted harassment. She was immediately suspended from the HOA board pending a full community vote for permanent removal. Furthermore, the Oversight Council issued a directive to the security company to reinstate Rafik, with full back pay for the days he was unjustly suspended. When the announcement was made, the room broke into applause, not wild cheering, but the kind of deep, relieved clapping that comes after a long, silent injustice finally sees light. Rafik, who had been watching quietly from the back, stood frozen. People turned toward him, nodding, some even standing to shake his hand. Karen stormed out without a word. But for Jamal, the battle wasn't over. He knew that power structures like the HOA weren't easy to dismantle. Karen still had supporters, people who liked having someone to keep things in order, even if that order came with fear. So he stayed. For the next several weeks, Jamal worked with the new interim board to introduce changes: transparency on fines, anonymous complaint forms, a formal appeals process for residents, and a third-party auditing of all previous citations issued under Karen's leadership. And he pushed for one more thing: training. Every board member, every security guard, and every HOA employee would undergo training in anti-bias protocols and conflict de-escalation paid for by HOA funds. The motion passed. Still, the fight had one more chapter. Because even though Karen was suspended and Rafik reinstated, Karen filed a counter-complaint claiming defamation and emotional trauma. Karen's counterattack came not with another phone call or public stunt, but in the form of a legal notice taped crudely to Rafik's door by a private courier, an official civil complaint for defamation of character and intentional emotional distress. She claimed that Jamal's public exposure of her 911 call and behavior had caused her to suffer social humiliation, severe anxiety, and had damaged her professional standing in the community. It was a laughable twist, the sort of legal maneuver that only someone with a bruised ego and no accountability would attempt. But Karen had always been brazen, and this time she wasn't trying to manipulate HOA policy. She was aiming to weaponize the court system. Rafik sat in stunned silence as he read the document, then handed it to Jamal, who immediately scanned each line with a calm, calculating gaze. "She's desperate," Jamal muttered, already flipping open his notepad. The lawsuit didn't just name Jamal, it listed Rafik as a co-defendant, accused of collusion and misconduct in the court of public opinion. The absurdity would have been comical if it weren't so personally devastating. Karen was attempting to turn the system back on them, to flip the narrative, to pretend she had been the victim all along. But what she failed to understand was that Jamal had been prepared for this kind of retaliation from day one. Within 48 hours, he retained legal counsel through a veterans advocacy network that provided pro bono legal services. Attorney assigned to the case, a sharp, battle-tested woman named Christine Wilder, reviewed the complaint and let out a single dry chuckle. "This woman's walking into a courtroom with a gasoline can," she said, "and she's suing the firefighters." Christine filed a motion to dismiss, citing the suit as frivolous and retaliatory. But because Karen had crafted it under civil tort law, it required at least one preliminary hearing. The community buzzed with disbelief when the news spread. Karen, the same woman who had called the cops on the neighborhood watchman, was now claiming to be the one traumatized. The hearing date was set for 3 weeks out. In that time, Jamal and Christine prepared with the precision of a military operation. They compiled every statement, every HOA email, every time-stamped video. Christine even subpoenaed HOA emails and discovered that Karen had sent messages prior to her 911 call implying that she was tired of seeing him every night and that someone needs to investigate that guard. That alone unraveled her entire claim of fear and anxiety. It proved premeditation, not distress. Meanwhile, Karen tried to gather sympathy. She began writing long posts on neighborhood forums, painting herself as the target of a smear campaign led by outsiders. She even accused Jamal of being militant and aggressive, claiming she felt endangered by his tactical demeanor. These posts were screenshotted and added to Christine's defense packet as further proof of her manipulative nature. By the time the hearing arrived, Karen's support had evaporated. Even the residents who had once sided with her, for the sake of order, were too embarrassed to speak publicly in her favor. The courtroom was filled once again with familiar faces: Angela, from the HOA board, the Mortons, Mr. Green in a wheelchair, even Franklin, the board member who once stayed silent, but now looked determined to speak if called. Karen entered dressed in dark navy, clutching a folder and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Her lawyer, a stiff man with a stack of yellow legal pads, began the hearing with a dramatic monologue about emotional damage and malicious character assassination. He accused Jamal of organizing a witch hunt and said Rafik's original incident was overblown by social theatrics. But it quickly unraveled under Christine's cross-examination. She calmly laid out the events. Karen's unauthorized clubhouse. Visit the 911 call despite recognizing Rafik. The lies in her complaint to the security company. The retaliatory lawsuit filed only after her suspension and the pattern of her behavior across years of HOA leadership, 88, from 8 different residents. Each one detailed a separate act of harassment, arbitrary fines, or forced entry. She ended her argument with Karen's own words from the email. "I'm sick of him always standing there like a statue. Someone needs to investigate that guard. Before something happens." That single sentence, which Christine highlighted on a large monitor, stripped Karen of any pretense of fear. It showed bias, a desire to provoke conflict, and a target in mind before anything ever occurred. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he did so with the same steady tone he'd used at the HOA hearing. "This case was never about character," he said. "It was about power." Karen believed that her position gave her the right to intimidate, accuse, and ruin. "My brother was one of many she treated this way. I spoke up not to defame her, but to protect everyone else she silenced." Then Rafiq stood. It was the first time he had spoken in a formal setting since the original incident. His voice was soft but unshaking. "I came here to work. I never argued with anyone. I just did my job. And she made me feel like a criminal for that. I don't know why. I don't want to know. I just don't want her to do it to anyone else." Courtroom was still. The judge, a woman known for her no-nonsense rulings, paused before delivering her decision. She first turned to Karen. "You filed this suit claiming emotional harm. But the evidence shows that you instigated the very conflict you're now claiming to suffer from. Your lawsuit appears to be a retaliatory move designed to silence those who held you accountable. I find no basis for your claims and am dismissing the suit with prejudice." She then turned to Christine. "If the defendants wish to pursue reimbursement for legal costs, the court is open to that filing." Karen's lawyer whispered something urgently, but she ignored him, standing rigid and expressionless. The gavel came down. Case dismissed. In the hallway afterward, residents approached Rafiq with quiet applause, handshakes, and gratitude. Someone hugged Jamal and thanked him for doing what no one else could, but neither brother was interested in praise. They simply wanted the weight lifted, the right to live and work without fear. Karen disappeared from the community soon. After her home went on the market within a month, sold under an LLC to avoid drawing attention, no one missed her. But her actions left an imprint, not of her legacy, but of what unchecked power can do to ordinary people. The HOA underwent a massive policy overhaul thanks to Angela's leadership and Jamal's ongoing support. A new ethics committee was formed. A clause was added to the bylaws requiring psychological screenings and diversity training for any board member seeking a leadership role. Perhaps the most symbolic change was the addition of a new plaque outside the clubhouse, one that read, "Community belongs to all." It was a small gesture, but one that meant everything to Rafiq, who resumed his night shifts with renewed purpose. No longer just a silent presence, he was now known, respected, and above all protected. But Karen wasn't done entirely. Rumors began circulating that she had joined the HOA of another nearby community, one known for its exclusivity and rigid standards. Karen may have vanished from Willowbend Lakes with her head lowered and reputation shattered, but she didn't vanish quietly, because people like her never do. While the community healed, growing closer through shared reform and lessons learned, Karen slithered into a new suburban neighborhood called Crest Mill Haven, a smaller but wealthier enclave just 20 minutes away, known for its manicured lawns, gated driveways, and a notorious reputation for strict enforcement of HOA rules. It wasn't long before she wormed her way into the board. Under the guise of a fresh voice with strong administrative experience, conveniently leaving out the details of her prior disgrace, with her charming facade polished anew, she convinced enough residents to support her for a spot on the Architectural Review Committee, a position she quickly abused by implementing arbitrary citations and tightening rules no one had asked for. Within a few months, Karen was doing what she did best, micromanaging lives under the pretense of community order. But what she didn't know was that Crest Mill Haven's HOA had a digital oversight forum, monitored by neighboring community liaisons, and one of those moderators was none other than Angela from Willowbend Lakes. Angela, now officially president of her HOA, had kept a distant eye on Karen since her removal. when she saw Karen's name pop up in a rule revision thread proposing mandatory curtain color regulations. Of all things, Angela felt her stomach twist. She immediately reached out to Jamal, forwarding screenshots and asking if he thought it was worth intervening. Jamal didn't hesitate. "She's repeating the cycle," he said. "She didn't learn. We can't let her harm another community like she harmed ours." But this time, they decided to do things differently. Instead of launching a public confrontation or filing an official complaint, Jamal began reaching out quietly to residents of Crestmill Haven, using local community message boards and social groups. He posted anonymously at first, asking if anyone had experienced unusual or excessive enforcement in recent months. The responses came trickling in. One homeowner mentioned being fined for parking their RV on their private driveway for less than 24 hours. Another was warned about having excessively bright garden lights, even though they matched HOA-approved models. A woman named Nadine shared that Karen had approached her directly to comment on her choice of mailbox paint, calling it degrading to the neighborhood's image. Jamal gathered these stories and reached out privately, slowly revealing Karen's full history. At Willow Bend Lakes. At first, many residents were shocked, unsure whether to believe it. Karen had arrived with glowing recommendations, likely fabricated had been all smiles at social gatherings. But Jamal wasn't interested in hearsay. He provided documented proof: the court hearing transcripts, HOA meeting minutes, the recording of the 911 call, and the council's ruling that had suspended her. The truth began to spread, first in whispers, then in growing murmurs across group chats and community meetings. Karen, meanwhile, had no idea she was under silent investigation. She continued her old patterns with renewed boldness, issuing warnings for fence heights, fining a family for leaving a bicycle on their porch, and even attempting to pass a rule that children under 10 be supervised at all times when outdoors, claiming it was a safety measure, when really it was another method of control. But her undoing came faster this time. Nadine, a soft-spoken yet sharp woman with legal experience, took it upon herself to formally challenge Karen's position. With the help of Jamal and other residents, she called for an emergency HOA meeting. Under Crestmill Haven's bylaws, which allowed homeowners to convene a board review if they gathered signatures from 20% of the residents. Within 10 days, they had more than double that. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, packed beyond capacity. Karen arrived as she always did, chin high, files in hand, the picture of false professionalism. But her smile faltered the moment she saw the crowd. These weren't her usual obedient neighbors. They looked serious, quiet, some with folders, others holding their phones as if ready to record. Nadine stood and opened the meeting with a single sentence. "We have credible evidence that one of our committee members, Ms. Haskins, has a documented history of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of authority in her previous community." The room didn't gasp this time. They were ready. Nadine continued with a presentation that mirrored the one Jamal had given months before, but this time supplemented with recent actions Karen had taken in Crestmill Haven. The board listened, uneasy. Karen attempted to interrupt multiple times, each time shut down by the HOA president, who insisted on hearing all evidence before she could respond. Then Jamal entered. He had been invited to speak as a guest, and when he introduced himself as the brother of the man Karen falsely accused, the atmosphere turned electric. "I'm not here out of revenge," he said calmly. "I'm here because silence let her keep going. And I think you deserve to know who you've allowed into your homes." Jamal briefly outlined the full arc: Karen's obsession with power, her lies, the court ruling, her retaliatory lawsuit, and how she fled once her reputation collapsed. "She's not enforcing standards," he concluded. "She's enforcing her own image of superiority, and anyone who doesn't fit that mold becomes a threat." Karen was visibly shaking when it was finally her turn to speak. She rambled about false narratives and vindictive agendas, but the words felt hollow, desperate. She claimed the prior ruling was biased, and that Jamal had orchestrated a campaign to stalk her across communities, which only made people more uncomfortable. She denied remembering the 911 call. She dismissed Rafiq as unmemorable. That was the final nail in her coffin. The very idea that she would call the police on a man she now claimed not to remember enraged the room. A motion was put forward to vote on her immediate removal. Out of the 52 voting households in attendance, 47 voted to strip her of all HOA authority effective immediately. Karen didn't stay to hear the final count. She stormed out before the votes were even tallied, the sound of her heels clicking like gunfire against the tile floor. This time she wouldn't recover. Her name was now tied to 2 separate HOA communities, both publicly documented as having removed her for misconduct. Online searches pulled up the entire story. She couldn't erase it. She couldn't start over again. Back in Willowbend Lakes, the news of her second downfall spread quickly. This time celebrated with small barbecues and knowing smiles among neighbors who had once feared her clipboard and glare. Rafiq, though quiet as ever, allowed himself a rare laugh when Jamal told him the whole story. "She tried again," he asked, sipping tea. "And failed again," Jamal said. "But this time, you didn't have to lift a finger." The truth moved faster than her lies. But even then, Jamal wasn't satisfied. He wanted more than Karen's collapse. He wanted lasting change in how HOAs treated power, handled conflict, and protected the vulnerable. After Karen's second fall from HOA power, there was a tangible sense of relief not just in Willowbend Lakes and Crestmill Haven, but in several nearby neighborhoods where word of her downfall spread like wildfire across local community forums, private Facebook groups, and nextdoor threads. She had become a symbol of what could happen when unchecked authority went too far, and more importantly, what could be done when people stood up to it with facts, discipline, and unity. Jamal, this wasn't the end. Watching his brother Rafiq quietly return to his normal night shifts, more respected now, but still largely invisible to those he protected, he realized that Karen had only been a symptom. The disease was deeper, crossed dozens of communities. Like theirs, HOAs were still dominated by power-hungry board members, many of whom operated in echo chambers of authority, unchecked by the very people they were supposed to serve. Jamal didn't just want justice for Rafiq anymore. He wanted reform, real, lasting legal reform. So he launched a campaign, starting small, using the same strategic thinking that had helped him expose Karen in 2 neighborhoods. He created a digital network called HOA Watchman, a free online resource where residents could share stories, upload anonymized complaints, and download templates for formal filings against abusive HOA actions. Within 2 weeks, over 1,000 residents from across the state had signed up. He hosted Zoom workshops for board accountability, invited community lawyers to speak on tenants and homeowners' rights, and encouraged whistleblowers within HOAs to speak up without fear. He also worked closely with Angela, who had become a symbol of ethical HOA leadership after publicly distancing herself from Karen. Together, they started lobbying local city councils to propose mandatory transparency protocols for HOAs, including requirements that all HOA board meetings be publicly recorded and made available online, and that any fine issued had to include proof, time-stamped evidence, and a clear appeal process. What began as a response to one woman's abuse of power had become a movement. And Rafiq, he didn't say much, but his story became the beating heart of that movement. When news outlets picked up on Jamal's efforts, they often featured a photo of Rafiq in uniform, stoic, soft-eyed, and quiet, standing by a community gate at sunset. The Watchman who was watched, one headline read. Local TV stations ran short features on him, and though he never appeared on camera, Jamal spoke on his behalf with pride and precision. "He was always there," Jamal told a reporter. And that's what this is really about. Seeing the eye, people who are always there for us, who we overlook until someone like Karen tries to erase them. Other communities soon reached out to Jamal for help. A neighborhood called Birchwood Pines had a board president who was caught fining people for using solar panels. Despite local law supporting them, a place called Harbors Cove had a treasurer who used HOA funds for personal travel. How Jamal didn't take them all on himself, but he helped those communities build their own versions of what he had done. Dunder evidence, find allies, and bring truth to light. And though Karen had faded from their lives, the lessons she taught them remained. Vivid, power without empathy is poison, and silence in the face of abuse is complicity. Jamal often returned to the bench near the community center where Rafiq took his short tea breaks. It had become something of a tradition every Friday night. He sat there, saying little, just watching the homes Rafik had once patrolled without recognition. "Do you ever think she'll try again?" Rafik asked once. "Karen," Jamal replied, then smiled. "No, not unless she finds a place where no one remembers her. And even then, we've made sure someone will." Angela later revealed that Karen had tried applying to a third HOA board position in a distant town, but by then, her digital reputation preceded her. A simple name search brought up full public records, and her application was rejected before it ever reached the voting stage. The system didn't forget her now. It remembered everything. On the 1-year anniversary of the night, Karen called 911 on Rafik. The community at Willowbend Lakes held a small gathering, not a party, but a moment of reflection and growth. They unveiled a commemorative bench beside the clubhouse pool, a small plaque affixed to its backrest reading, "To those who protect with quiet strength, thank you." It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about gratitude. Rafik sat there that evening, sipping his tea, beside Jamal, beside Angela, surrounded by people who had once ignored him, but now knew his name and his story. And that was the real victory. Jamal eventually returned to his unit overseas, but his HOA Watchline movement continued to grow. He left it in the hands of volunteers, attorneys, and residents like Angela, who had learned to lead not by controlling, but by listening. Every new member of the board at Willowbend Lakes now underwent a peer review, community vote, and mandatory training. Rafik remained their watchman not because he couldn't do anything else, but because he chose to. Dear God, because even after everything, he still believed in protecting people. He still believed in service. His silence was never weakness. It was strength the world had failed to recognize, but not anymore. So the next time you see someone standing quietly in the shadows, guarding your gates or sweeping your paths, remember Rafik, and remember that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who's right. Sometimes, justice arrives in the quiet footsteps of someone who refuses to be broken. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that power only matters when it protects, not punishes, then make sure to support more stories like this. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel for powerful HOA drama, real world, justice, and unforgettable true tales where ordinary people stand tall against the Karens of the world. We're not just telling stories, we're exposing truths. Don't miss what's coming next.